The Great Depression was one of the worst economic downturns in the industrialized world. While no group escaped the economic devastation of the Great Depression, few suffered more than African Americans. African Americans across the country already occupied a fragile position within the economy. By the late 20s, many African Americans toiled away in domestic service jobs, farmers, and as service workers marked by low wages, weak job security, and questionable labor conditions. Approximately 11 million African Americans in the South were principally used as sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and wage workers. Only 10% of those Black Southerners actually owned land. Most cultivated crops on white-owned land and received a small share of the harvest. Most Black Southerners were locked into this endless cycle of exploitation, malnutrition, disenfranchisement, and violence, especially the dangers of lynching and sexual assault. Welcome to One Mic. I'm your host, Country Boy, and as you might know, this episode is about African Americans and the Great Depression. As usual, if you like this, please consider donating to our Patreon page or Buy Me Coffee. You can find a link down in the description below. Also, you can find my older episodes on onemichistory.com, and please remember to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. Without further ado, let's get started. In October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed. During a period of 10 weeks, stocks on the New York Stock Exchange lost more than 50% of their value. The national income fell from $81 billion in 1929 to just $40 billion in 1932. Americans would begin to lose faith in banks, and the panic would deepen their despair. And as banks failed, businesses closed and unemployment rose dramatically. The life savings of many Americans was lost, leaving Americans destitute with no job and no savings, and thousands of Americans lost their homes. The poor congregated in shacks on the edge of cities across the nations, and hundreds of thousands of unemployed roamed the country on foot or by boxcar in a futile search for jobs. The Great Depression triggered immediate suffering in Black communities. But the early days, many African Americans felt as though the Depression was a white problem and that they would finally know what it was like to struggle as they did. Economic conditions in the South were already poor in the early 20s, but the Great Depression marked a new low. The demand for cotton and sugar fell with the economy, and as farmers grew more crops, the supply increased and the prices plummeted. Between 1929 and 1933, the price of cotton dropped from 18 cents to just 6 cents, which was exacerbated Black Southerners' already precarious situation in the economy. With the decline of cotton prices, the number of Black sharecroppers fell, and in northern cities where 1.6 million African Americans escaped to during the Great Migration, Black unemployment reached as high as 50%. The numbers climbed to 60% for workers in Philadelphia and Detroit. The Great Depression initially slowed the pace of the Great Migration, but African Americans would continue to stream out of the South even into the 30s. African Americans lost their jobs in parts of the economy where they had finally gained a major foothold. In 1929, occupations such as garbage collections, working in foundries, or domestic service were seen as Negro work and hence lacked white competition. As desperation set in white America, not only did they have increased competition for these jobs, but they started to use old tactics of terror and intimidation to convince employers to fire the Black workers. Domestic service and laundry work was especially hard hit because few families could afford domestic help, and with many impoverished women coming into the cities, families that did have money found they can employ impoverished, destitute women for almost nothing. African American families used survival tactics like pooling together resources and working together to help survive the downturn. For example, women and their families lived in crowded tenements in which they shared bathrooms and other facilities, including hot plates, stoves, and sinks. They bartered and exchanged goods and services because money was so tight. By 1933, even mutual aid strategies were strained to the breaking point. Before Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, private charities and sometimes state and local governments were responsible for providing aid to economic hardships. But even in good times, these institutions provided very little for all those that needed help, and African Americans had a much harder time getting aid than white Americans, and when they were given aid, they was given much less. The Depression made it almost impossible for the nation's charitable organizations to meet the need for more than a small portion of the hungry and unemployed. Also, state and local governments could not or would not be able to provide unemployment insurance or increase welfare benefits to ease the suffering of the most vulnerable during this disaster. Despite the economic disaster and the need to alleviate pressure amongst the most vulnerable citizens, President Herbert Hoover hesitated to respond. Steeped in free market ideology at the time, he believed that government should do little to interfere with the workings of the economy. He suggested that local governments and charities should address the need of the unemployed homeless masses. Hoover was a man trapped in his own ideologies, and he watched as Americans began to settle in what they called Hoovervilles, which were a cluster of shacks made of tin, cardboard, and burlap that resided next to railroad tracks or dumps. He still refused to allow the federal government to provide direct relief, and Hoover also attempted to create an all-white Republican Party in the South by cultivating white Southerners in an attempt to appoint Judge John Park of North Carolina, who was a separatist, to the Supreme Court. For decades, the Nationalist Republican Party had treated black voters with contempt and often declined to reward their patronage. These policies looked far worse during the Great Depression, with the added suffering of African Americans. So in 1932, voters elected New York Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt to the presidency. Roosevelt won in a lopsided victory over Herbert Hoover, demonstrating the country's loss in faith in Republican Party and their economic philosophy. The new president appealed to the Democratic Party's base of Southern whites, but he also grouped together Western farmers, industrial workers, white ethnic groups in northern cities, and for the first time, African Americans voted for Democrats. Still, many African Americans clung to the Republican banner, but after Roosevelt was elected, he attempted to counter the Depression by inaugurating a multitude of social programs collectively known as the New Deal. That would shift the allegiance of African Americans and result in a new political order in America. To pass his New Deal, Roosevelt pressed Congress for an infusion of bold new economic initiatives. Met with very little resistance, Congress passed the president's complex laws to overhaul the nation's financial, agricultural, and industrial systems. One of his first moves Roosevelt made was to counter the immediate suffering of the unemployed by a massive emergency federal relief effort. Most of the New Deal's early programs benefited both black and white Americans, but the strength of white Southerners and the Democratic Party and the complete lack of African American political power in the South caused African Americans to miss out on many of these programs. One of the best examples of this is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, designed to protect farmers by giving them subsidies to limit production, thereby stabilizing the price of crops. The idea of the AAA was to lessen the production would increase agricultural prices, so farmers would be paid more to grow less. The program provided sharecroppers and tenement farmers with a part of the subsidy and allowed for rural relief agencies to dispense supplementary income to off-season wage workers. The program program helped benefit African Americans mainly because it pumped billions of dollars into the economic sector in which 5 million African Americans worked for their livelihood. The money from the AAA slowed the exodus of Black Americans from farming, but the AAA's actual results to Black farmers was often contrary to the protections written into law and was often administered unfairly and corruptly. Local control of the AAA resided in the hands of the Extension Service and the county's Agricultural Conservation Committee, which represented all local farmers. But the county's agents were often the farmers themselves, and the committee mirrored Southern politics by simply excluding African Americans. African Americans were further disadvantaged by a system of unilateral bookkeeping and oppressive race relations between landlords and tenants. During the first 2 years of the AAA, Black farmers complained bitterly that white landlords simply pocketed millions of dollars in relief checks that were supposed to be forwarded to the tenants. To make matters worse, some farmers simply evicted the sharecroppers and tenants from their land. The New Deal's welfare programs included Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Public Works Administration, the Civil Works Administration. These programs were some of the only things standing between African Americans and starvation during the Great Depression. The FERA provided funds to local and state relief operations to restart and expand their relief programs. These programs pulled millions of Americans from the edge of starvation, and because African Americans suffered greater economic devastation, they received benefits at a higher rate than white Americans. In some northern cities, African Americans received 25 to 40% of the FERA's relief. Roosevelt's administration felt that direct welfare was the debilitation, so the government attempted to emphasize hiring unemployed for public works projects. The CWA was a temporary organization created to help people through the winter of 1933 to 1934, and the CCC built segregated camps to employ young men and remove them from poverty and hopelessness of urban areas. But once again, these tended to be less helpful to African Americans than white Americans. In the early days of the CCC, only 5% of the available slots went to young African Americans, and the FERA was only administered fairly in northern cities, and in the South, it rarely met the people who actually needed the help. The time period and the Roosevelt administration was not completely bleak for African Americans. African Americans gained new influence and allies within the Roosevelt administration. Their experience reflects in an emerging consciousness among white liberals about the problems of African Americans and the potential electoral power of those African Americans. African Americans also formed new organizations to help fight for their economic and political rights. In 1931, Black sharecroppers in Alabama established the Alabama Sharecroppers Union. In 1935, Mary McLeod Bethune founded the National Council of Negro Women, which serves as a civil rights organization for Black women. The NCNW was designed to lobby for Black women's interests with a special emphasis on employment opportunities. In 1936, John P. Davis and Ralph Bunchy formed the National Negro Congress and its youth organization, the Southern Negro Youth Congress. The NNC and the SNYC reached down to a grassroots level and recruited activists, students, workers to fight for Black rights. Black men, women, and especially young people banded together in these new protest organizations to stage militant campaigns across the country. Activists fought to broaden the New Deal's programs, improve living conditions of African Americans, organize Black workers into industrial unions, protest disenfranchisement, and protect African Americans from violence, especially lynching and police brutality. In northern urban cities, black women and men staged "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaigns. Citizens picket outside of white-owned stores and restaurants in black neighborhoods that wouldn't hire black workers. They also withheld their patronage from these establishments and intimidated black customers. These protests were largely successful and resulted in the hiring of hundreds of unemployed or underemployed black men and women. And these grassroots protests in the 30s demonstrated the power of mass action and would help provide inspiration in the years to come. The Roosevelt administration's accessibility to African American leaders and New Deal reforms strengthened black support within the Democratic Party. A number of African American leaders were members of the Black Cabinet, which was a name for a group of black advisors to Roosevelt. As white administrators of New Deal programs began to tap these black advisors for government programs with greater regularity, among them was educator Mary McLeod Bethune, who served as the National Youth Administrator's Director of Negro Affairs, an agency that was focused on finding job opportunities for young people. Mary McLeod Bethune cultivated a public relationship with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and educated her on the particular problems that African Americans faced in the United States. Eleanor Roosevelt would elevate her standing with African Americans and became an ally to civil rights causes and racial injustice. As Eleanor Roosevelt supported a federal anti-lynching bill, an end to the poll tax, and increased funding for black schools. And members of the Black Cabinet worked in concert with civil rights organizations to pressure New Deal agencies and programs to end racial bias. By 1935, 2 years after a slow recovery, much of the New Deal laid in shambles. The Supreme Court had invalidated major parts of it, and a conservative backlash had emerged against the Roosevelt administration. In response, Roosevelt pushed for a second burst of legislation, marked by the passage of the Social Security Act and the National Labor Relations Act, and the creation of the Works Progress Administration. The National Labor Relations Act helped unions get established and grow. The Social Security Act provided the rudiments of the social welfare system, as well as unemployment and retirement insurance. These new set of laws was known as the Second New Deal and survived legal challenges and fundamentally changed the United States, mostly by strengthening the role of the federal government. The 1936 election marked a major test for Franklin Delano Roosevelt as well as black politics. His bid for a second term in office, FDR actively courted the black vote, envisioning African Americans as part of his expanding electoral coalition that included workers, European immigrants, and white Southerners. President Roosevelt was very delicate around the question of race and didn't support an anti-lynching legislation publicly, but he did appeal to black voters by touting his record of black appointments and government programs that assisted African Americans. By the mid-1930s, black voters registration was at an all-time high in northern cities, and at Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia in June of 36, 32 African Americans served as delegates, which was a first for the Democratic Party. And then weeks before the election, FDR sent his maid, Elizabeth McDuffie, on the campaign trail to offer her personal testimony about the Democratic Party's commitment to African Americans. McDuffie held rallies and spoke to thousands of black citizens. As a child of a former slave, McDuffie argued that the New Deal represented a second emancipation of African Americans, and this outreach worked. Roosevelt's leftward shift of politics helped him win the 1936 election in another landslide. He captured 61% of the total vote, but he won 70% 76% of the African American vote. The Great Migration had relocated tens of thousands of prospective black voters to northern industrial cities, and institutionalized housing segregation combined with the conscious choice to live in their own neighborhoods concentrated the black electorate and increased their political power. This election cemented the relationship between African Americans and the Democratic Party. The shift to the Democratic Party allowed for the first black Democrat, Arthur W. Mitchell, to win a seat to Congress. Mitchell's election was only the start of the African Americans' political identification. The black press fanned the flames of the developing intense interest in politics, and the black press began to make the connection between political power and the prospect of improving their own economic conditions. The move to the Democratic Party was a complex one and didn't come without anxiety. Some black voters feared that by joining the party, they would open the door for more Southern Democrats to assume national power, and other black voters laminated that neither party offered a robust response to black poverty and civil rights. Despite the rise of black Democrats, Southern congressmen continued to succeed in excluding African Americans from government programs. They insisted on denying benefits on the National Labor Relations Act and the Social Security Act to agricultural workers and domestic servants. But they could not tilt all of the domestic services this way. The Works Progress Administration, with its administrator, Harry Hopkins, was created to employ the unemployed. Under Hopkins, the WPA put thousands of men and women to work on public works projects like roads, hospitals, city halls, and schools. They even worked on some larger infrastructure projects like the Lincoln Tunnel and the Boulder Dam, which was renamed the Hoover Dam in 1946. The WPA was administered far more fairly than the earlier New Deal programs. The program appointed a series of black advisors to design programs that would assist African Americans. In the first year alone, 200,000 African Americans joined the WPA's programs, and the number climbed steadily each year after that. The WPA constructed black schools and community centers and opened domestic service training centers and conducted adult education classes and oversaw a myriad of art projects. But even the WPA was not without its issues. Many New Deal programs failed to address black structural inequality that laid in the root of American society. The WPA limited black women's employment opportunities to domestic service training programs and sewing programs, both of which were low-paying jobs, while white women were able to seek other opportunities in other industries like clerical work or gardening or nursing. However, similarly, when the WPA constructed black housing projects, they engaged in slum clearance by demolishing black neighborhoods. The practice created housing shortage for African Americans in already segregated cities and paved a way for urban renewal projects in the post-war era. When Congress created the United States Housing Authority in 1937, the Bureau did not issue mortgages to African Americans in racially integrated neighborhoods. In all these instances, the New Deal programs would not touch America's landscape of racial segregation or labor segmentation. Also, during the New Deal, domestic service workers were left in abject poverty. Not only were they excluded from the National Labor Relations and the Social Security Act, but white families reeling from the Depression fired servants or slashed their wages. In 1935, activists Ella Baker and Marvel Cook wrote a landmark piece published in the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis, entitled The Bronx Slave Market. The piece chronicled the desperation of black servants who crowded the streets of the Bronx to white housewives who would hire them for day wages. By using the term slave market, Baker and Cook underscored the severity of the black women's economic predicament and intersected race, class, gender during the Depression. One job in Washington, D.C. for a federal charwoman, a worker who cleaned government offices, and the position paid higher wages than domestic service and even offered retirement benefits. When the government announced that they were accepting applications for these positions, between 10 and 20,000 black women showed up for these jobs. Many of them spent the night at the station in order to obtain a good place in line. Their numbers were so large that officials had to stop distributing applications and turn towards crowd control. And when the women learned that they would not be able to receive a job application, they began to express anger and frustration as white police officers were dispatched to contain the crowds of rioting women. This is one illustration of the dire economic circumstances experienced by black domestic service workers and their families. Throughout the New Deal, the federal government began to finance art projects and in turn involve significant black engagement. Not only were writers and actors, photographers, and painters suffering a higher rate of unemployment than any other category, but New Deal's administrators argued that arts was a crucial part of the nation's vitality. Largely through the WPA, the federal government organized the Federal Theater Project, the Federal Writers Project, which employed writers and playwrights, and the Federal Writers Project also dispatched interviewers to the South to interview former slaves and became an invaluable research to historians about slavery. Finally, the Farmer Securities Administration hired photographers to travel across the country and document the lives of ordinary Americans. Not only was the FSA recruiting black photographers, but white photographers also snapped searing images of African Americans. And collectively, all of these initiatives enabled African Americans to defy some of the precarious stereotypes that had been perpetuated against them throughout American culture. African American artists participated enthusiastically in both the FWP and the FTP. During the 20s, cities in Chicago and New York and Washington, D.C. had witnessed a flourishing of black arts through literature, poetry, film, and playwrights. And these artistic communities had laid the groundwork for the black participation in the New Deal's artistic programs. Both the FWP and the FTP had Negro divisions that oversaw black projects. The FTP Negro Division staged plays, hired black actors and directors, and took black stories very seriously. The FTP Negro Division traveled to 22 cities across the country and enabled African Americans to interact with this new innovative type of theater. The black performers not only acted in the plays with themes rooted in African American history and culture, such as racial prejudice, the Haitian Revolution, and lynching, and they also performed all black productions of plays like Macbeth, which reset expectations of black actors portraying historically white characters. During the 30s, African Americans used every resource at their disposal to fight against racial injustice in their quest for opportunity, and they began to spark the labor movement. The relations between African Americans and labor unions had always been profound during the 20s and the 30s. Before the 30s, most unions affiliated with the American Federation of Labor and barred African Americans or restricted them to segregated locals. The railroad union completely excluded black workers, but this changed with the New Deal. In 1935, Congress passed the Wagner Act, which upheld the right for workers to organize labor unions and participate in collective bargaining and stage strikes, which nurtured a more productive climate for industrial black workers. The largest black union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, negotiated a contract with the Pullman Company to reduce their hours and increase wages. The National Labor Relations Act offered an opportunity to organize the nation's masses of production industries, but the AFL was unwilling to incorporate unskilled workers into their ranks, and this excluded many European immigrants and African Americans. Angry about this situation, John L. Lewis, head of the United Mine Workers, and his followers formed a committee for the Congress of Industrial Organizations to take on this task. And unlike the AFL, the CIO was an interracial organization, was established so African Americans could participate in the labor movement. The CIO made racial equality central to its organization by fighting against pay scales, hiring black organizers in all of its unions, and the CIO became a civil rights ally by lobbying against a poll tax and supporting a federal anti-lynching law and fighting against labor discrimination. Black tobacco workers and red caps joined CIO-affiliated unions to fight for economic justice in the 1930s. Its leaders knew that it was in the organization's best interest to admit black men and women into its membership, even though their membership remained overwhelmingly male workers. One black organizer said that we colored folks can't organize without you, and you white folks can't organize without us. Some African Americans even turned to communism. When the Communist Party USA was founded in the United States, it had almost no black members, but the Communist Party had mostly attracted members from European immigrants and various foreign language federations formerly associated with the Socialist Party of America. But throughout the 30s, the Communist Party intensified its support of African American efforts to address unemployment, job discrimination, and to seek social justice. The communist militant anti-racism stance and its determination to be interracial attracted some African Americans, although very few African American men and women actually joined the Communist Party. Some of them became increasingly sympathetic to the left-wing ideas. And as the Depression wore on, many black workers were drawn to the Communist Party because of the refusal of organized white labor to include them. They insisted on this anti-Negro stance, and it allowed labor leaders to split the ranks of labor and carry on their policies of divide and rule. This left many African Americans frustrated by the racism of capitalism and believed that they would never actually represent African Americans. The NAACP also became a more effective advocate for African American civil rights in the 30s. The NAACP was an interracial organization and took the lead in pressing the government to protect African Americans' rights and eliminate racism in government programs. One of the biggest changes for the NAACP was the leadership of Walter White. Walter White was a man that easily could have passed for white with his blonde hair and blue eyes, and he was not subject to the same issues as other African Americans, but instead he was a lobbyist for civil rights and racial injustice and personally investigated 42 lynchings. White let it be known that African Americans and the NAACP would not be silent against the previous Hoover administration's proposed consolidation of Southern white sentiment by sacrificing the Negro and their rights, as well as the NAACP paid very close attention to the New Deal's programs and put pressure on administrators to end racial bias. For example, in 1933, the Civilian Conservation Corps enrolled only 5% of young African American men. But after the NAACP put pressure on the CCC, 200,000 African Americans participated in the program by 1940. The NAACP sponsored a legal campaign against education discrimination and political disenfranchisement led by two brilliant lawyers in Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall. The legal team won a landmark case, Murray versus Maryland in 1936 and Missouri Gaines versus Canada in 1938, both of which withered away at racial segregation in professional and graduate schools. They also scored a victory in the Supreme Court with Hale versus Kentucky in 1938, which opened up jury service to African Americans. And the national NAACP, along with some of their local branches, aligned with the Communist Party, despite worries about the party's radicalism, to secure justice for the Scottsboro Nine. Black teenagers were accused of raping two white women on a train in Alabama in 1931. All but the youngest one was given death sentence by electrocution in Alabama courts. The defendants were ultimately exonerated and released from jail. The NAACP was not without its critics, even within its own ranks. In 1934, W.E.B. Du Bois, editor of The Crisis, began advocating for a program of self-determination. He hoped that it would permit blacks to be able to develop an economic nation within a nation. Du Bois acknowledged that this internal economy would only meet a part of the needs of African American community, but he insisted that it could develop and expand once it had its foundation. Du Bois was attacked for advocating for voluntary segregation, and the idea that black business could succeed within a segregated economy was called a myth. This agreement forced the end of his editorialship in The Crisis and led to his resignation from the NAACP. Ironically, by the end of the 1930s, the NAACP was putting greater emphasis on economic policies and was backing the growing labor movement. The industrial boom began with the outbreak of World War II in Europe in 1939. The massive spending during wartime ended the Great Depression. However, unemployed whites were generally the first to be given jobs, and although discrimination remained widespread during the war, more than 12 million Americans were sent into the military, and similar number toiled away at defense-related jobs. This reduced unemployment to a rate below pre-depression levels, and African Americans were able to secure jobs and better wages and within a greater range of occupations than ever before. The Great Depression and the New Deal represented a watershed moment for African Americans throughout this country and reshaped the 20th century's trajectory of black life in the United States. In the 1930s, African Americans suffered more than any other group, but by the 1940s, black politics had undergone a radical change. The majority of voters now identified with the Democratic Party and used this party as a vehicle for civil rights and economic justice. The black cabinet and racial advisors and the federal government turned towards African Americans for advice on federal programs. African Americans scored important legal victories in the United States with the right to serve on juries, stage pickets, and integrate in graduate and professional schools. These legal triumphs were crucial ingredients for the landmark 1954 Supreme Court decision Brown versus the Board of Education and the post-war African American freedom struggle. At a grassroots level, black men and women formed local organizations, staged economic boycotts, picketed businesses, joined labor unions, and engaged in strikes and riots for better jobs. Culturally, African Americans were able to defy racial stereotypes and continue to control how the black experience was represented in American culture. Thank you, Country Boy. This has been One Mic. Once again, if you enjoy this, you love this, please consider donating to my Patreon page or buy me coffee. You will find that link down in the description below. Also, you can find more episodes like this one at onemyblackhistory.com. Also, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. And peace.